Today, probably everyone knows about the incident at Dyatlov Pass. In 1959, 10 brave athletes, 2 women and 8 men, went on a ski trip through the Ural forests and mountains. Unfortunately, 9 of them tragically died in a desolate, snowy area. The deaths of the 9 professional tourists were investigated by the authorities. It seemed that the experts had formed a coherent picture of what happened. The students made a number of minor errors in the domestic management of their camp. In the conditions of severe frosts and storms, this proved to be enough. The elements overcame the team. People died. Law enforcement published reports on the investigation of the case. The funerals of the Dyatlov group members were grand and widely covered by journalists. It would seem that after mourning the deceased, society should have calmed down. However, this did not happen even many years later. The events at Dyatlov Pass have been stirring the minds of thousands of people around the world for over 60 years. And it's not surprising because there are many inconsistencies, strange, unnatural, and even eerie details in this story. We have studied them all and selected 10 most significant facts that cast doubt on the official version of events. Perhaps the first alarming fact concerning the Dyatlov group was the official conclusion of the authorities about what happened. In the press, one could only see the most general explanations of the incident. The cause of the death of the 9 athletes was referred to, if quoting the experts literally, as a natural force of insurmountable character. This vague formulation could hide anything. Therefore, the story immediately began to be overgrown with a record number of speculations, and soon there were so many of them that the essence of the incident simply began to get lost. The funerals of the tourists, whose bodies were found months after the hike, were grand and widely covered in the press. However, then they abruptly stopped talking about the situation. The case was officially classified. Rumors about the tragedy became more and more unrealistic each year. People told each other that the students were visited by alien ships, evil natural spirits, shamans. Many called the deceased geologists, claimed that they saw wounds from bullets, torture, acid on their bodies. Incredibly diverse and numerous rumors literally flooded the Urals and all of Russia, turning the story of the students into a simple fairy tale. Many believed that the special services tried to distort and eradicate the memory of the tragedy with the help of disinformation. In a few seconds, we will continue to dissect the mysterious story of the Dyatlov Pass. But before that happens, please subscribe to our channel. Click on the bell. This way you will be able to see our freshest videos first. The group of experienced tourist and athlete Igor Dyatlov consisted of 10 people. Almost all of them, except for 38-year-old Semyon Zolotarev, were young, healthy students of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, full of achievements and ambitions. Each was successful in studies and other areas, had a solid experience in tourism, and held sports titles. Planning their first winter trip to the Ural, the team developed an unusual route. It was classified as a Category 3, the highest level of difficulty, and involved skiing through the winter forest for at least 300 kilometers. On the occasion of the 21st Congress of the CPSU, the team wanted to become famous and earn new sports titles. The officially approved plan of the hike involved passing by the foot of Mount Kholat Syakhl. During the USSR period, when ideas of materialism and atheism were popular, it was briefly called Height 1079. However, the Mansi people, who have lived in the Ural Mountains for thousands of years, called this place in their language the Dead Mountain. In the Soviet era, it was encouraged to believe that such a name indicated the sparse vegetation on the slopes. But the indigenous people carefully preserved legends that for tens of thousands of years, Kholat Syakhl has been taking human lives. But not always, only when exactly 9 people visit it together. According to elders, its first victims were the Mansi, escaping from a great flood 13,000 years ago. Then, there were evil sorcerers from an enemy tribe, killed by the Mansi, who left their spirit helpers on the slopes. One can believe in ancient tales, or, like the members of the Dyatlov group, be skeptics. But reality somehow confirms the legend. As written in the tourists' diaries found at their death site, Troubles on the hike began immediately as soon as there were only 9 participants left. One team member, Yuri Yudin, fell ill and returned to the city. And already in the next year after the group's death, in 1960, an air crash occurred in approximately the same area. Strangely enough, there were also 9 victims. The events that occurred with Igor Dyatlov's group were accompanied by a strange phenomenon. Many eyewitnesses gave testimony to the investigation, according to which flying round lights appeared in the taiga during the period of the tourists' disappearance. This was reported by most of the searchers involved in the search for the bodies, soldiers from a military base within sight of Mount Kholat Syakhl, some police officers, and numerous local residents. Additionally, for decades, independently of each other, many tourists have spoken about unexplained lights attacking people in the Ural forests. Similar incidents even occur today. The terrifying guesses about the students' encounter with flying objects were largely confirmed by the investigation. Several very suspicious photographs were found in the athletes' cameras. One of them, taken in the dark, captured a blurred, possibly rapidly approaching glowing object. Several other photos showed flying objects in the clear sky, both at night and during the day. Interpretations of these facts vary today. Direct participants in the events, those who searched for the group, believe in the version of people's death due to secret tests. Evgeny Pavlov, a young man who was friends with 2 of the missing athletes, involved his father in the search. Alexei Budrin, a man who personally participated in the operation, both assert that they found corresponding evidence at the scene of the tragedy. They have reason to believe that the students witnessed classified military tests, for which they paid with their lives. This is indirectly confirmed by the experts' finding of radiation on the clothing of several tourists. The dose was large, impossible to acquire in an industrial setting. The orange hue of the corpse's skin also indicates the presence of nuclear burns. In the early 1990s, the prosecutor who handled the case of the deceased group gave a series of sensational interviews to the press. Lev Ivanov revealed that he had previously been obliged to keep the tragedy a secret, but after the change of power, he gained freedom. The law enforcement officer claimed that he had real evidence that the tourists were killed by lights, possibly of extraterrestrial origin. Ivanov pointed to the scorched tops of the fir trees near the site of the deaths and to inexplicable damage to the bodies. The deceased had no external injuries, but their internal organs were crushed. In the existing conditions, such injuries could only be caused by experiencing a narrowly directed explosive wave. Some experts, such as Doctor of Technical Sciences Anatoly Yarusov, believe that the tragedy at the Dyatlov Pass could have been caused by toxic substances. Specifically, there is mention of nitrogen dioxide, released during rocket launches. The timing of the students' hike coincided with launches at the Baikonur and Plesetsk cosmodromes. Despite the great distances, experts believe that clouds of exhaust gases and nuclear fuel particles could have accidentally settled on the taiga. As a result of the presumed poisoning by volatile toxins, the athletes in the tent might have experienced panic, confusion, and hallucinations. This could have led even experienced tourists to flee into the freezing cold without clothes and shoes, heading down the slope. While their minds were clouded, they made ineffective attempts at rescue, and later simply died from the cold and injuries. Some group members had characteristic foam in their respiratory tracts and brownish skin due to the poison. 2 of the 9 students who died in the Ural forest, Georgy Krivonishenko and Rustam Slobodin, were found by investigators without clothes. Only underwear remained on the snow-covered bodies of the young men. All the rest, as established by experts, had been cut off. This circumstance takes on special significance, considering that these tourists worked at nuclear facilities. In Soviet times, such facilities were located in strictly closed cities, and their activities were classified. Information about such plants was literally hunted by enemy intelligence. It's also a strange coincidence that Semyon Zolotarev joined the student group at the last moment. This 38-year-old tourism instructor was not previously acquainted with the guys, who had long been a close-knit group. It was originally stated that Zolotarev would go on a hike with another team, but just before the start, he changed his mind, stating that it would be more convenient with Dyatlov, as he promised to finish the journey earlier than the other leader. Semyon, who for some reason introduced himself to everyone as Alexander, was not a simple person. During the war, he served in Smersh as an informant for the leadership. Moving from squad to squad, he learned and reported the situation. Later, he became a KGB employee, then a tourism instructor. Combining all these facts, one can assume that within the framework of the hike, Soviet Special Services planned a secret operation. Krivonashenko or Slobodin, recruited at their enterprises, were supposed to pass their own clothing to enemy agents. It contained traces of radioactive substances needed by foreigners to study the activities of the USSR's secret plants. Zolotarev was supposed to control the delivery and the work of future double agents. However, instead of handing over the textiles packed with valuable chemicals, enemy agents decided to kill the group. Naturally, this had to be done covertly. Therefore, they simply forced the tourists to leave the tent and run into the forest. After cutting the shelter to ensure that the students could not save themselves and taking the very clothes, the foreigners disappeared. Over more than 3 weeks, while the deceased were being searched for, the tracks of the attackers on skis were smoothed out by heavy snowfalls. It is known that in Soviet times, discipline and dedication were cultivated in most organizations, and a shortage of staff was a rare phenomenon. Therefore, the numerous delays and errors in the investigation of the fate of the Dyatlov group seem very strange. Initially, the hike's supervisor hid from the authorities the team's failure to arrive at their destination, the village of Vizhai. The official falsely reported the students' arrival by sending a telegram to Sverdlovsk. The alarm was only raised by the athletes' relatives. The search only began on February 6th, while the group was expected on February 3rd. 4. Despite the large number of volunteers involved in the operation, the first bodies were only discovered in late February. During the investigation of the tourists' deaths in the city of Ivdel, 2 prosecutors involved in the case went insane. They were replaced by a new specialist, Lev Ivanov, who years later confessed that the authorities directly instructed him on what to write in the conclusions. In 1959, when the case was transferred to Sverdlovsk, 2 more policemen committed suicide, leaving notes with very strange content. Later, the KGB classified the materials. Considering that the case was not related to state interests, the deceased were just students, not scientists or military personnel. This seems very odd. Numerous well-known facts indicate that a quick and proper investigation of the events at Dyatlov Pass was not in the government's interest. The official investigation into the death of the Dyatlov group concluded with the publication of the investigators' findings. It stated that the tourists died due to a small local avalanche of a special type called a snow slab, which means the sliding of a plate of dense snow over a layer of loose snow. The athletes dug too deep into the snow on the mountain slope to set up their tent. The snow layer cracked, and when the wind brought more snow, it became too heavy and fell. Frightened, sleepy people hastily left their warm shelter, fearing another fall of the heavy layer, and rushed to hide in the forest at the foot of the mountain. This theory indirectly confirms the presence and nature of injuries in some of the tourists. 3 members of the group had severe internal fractures and hematomas, organ ruptures, but their skin was intact. However, many people do not believe that the students were killed by natural forces, and there are several reasons for this. In the place of the tragedy, the slope was not very steep, about 20 degrees. Avalanches are only possible there under heavy snowfalls, and meteorologists stated that there were no such precipitations during the students' hike. When the tent was discovered by rescuers, it was only covered with about 20 centimeters of snow and not everywhere. All its supports, ski poles, except for one, were in place. This is proven by photos of the tent setup process taken by the athletes. If there was a snow slab, where did it go? There were also no traces of its further movement down the slope. If we assume that a mass of snow fell on the tourists, crushing their skulls and ribs, as reflected in the conclusions, then why didn't it damage the items? Cameras, utensils, and even food were found in the tent. Everything was intact and in its place. The official report by the authorities stated that 3 members of the team, whose bodies were found separately from the others, had severe injuries. Nikolai Thibault Brignol was found with an extensive depressed skull fracture. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had multiple rib fractures, with the girl having particularly complex bilateral fractures. Externally, the skin in the injured areas of the tourists was intact, but the deep, soft tissues were crushed. Soviet experts concluded that these injuries were due to the pressure of a snow slab on the tent, and that Dubinina and Zolotaryov reached the foot of the mountain on their own, where they died. However, modern specialists disagree with this. Yuri Nikolaevich Bezrukov, a candidate of medical sciences, associate professor of the forensic science department, studied the case materials and drew his conclusions. He asserts that the injuries sustained by these 3 tourists definitely would not have allowed them to walk 1.5 kilometers through deep snow. If Thibault Brignol was unconscious and being carried, as indicated by the tracks, then Dubinina and Zolotaryov walked on their own. But multiple complex rib fractures cause pain shock, rupture of lung membranes, and acute respiratory failure. Therefore, the old version is untenable. The mysterious injuries were not sustained in the tent. This conclusion by modern scientists casts doubt on the official version of events and points to errors in the investigation. One of the first theories in the Dyatlov Group case was the murder of Russian students by representatives of the local Mansi people. There were reasons for this assumption. The Aborigines constantly visited local forests for hunting. The tourists passed through their areas. Photos captured runic marks on trees, storages, and drying racks of the locals. The Mansi believed in spirits and held sanctuaries in the mountains. Kholat Syakhl was considered a resting place for ancestors. A local policeman was told that several Khants lived as hermits in the forest. This ethnic group is known for its aggression. A year before the tourists' tragedy, some Mansi killed a Russian teacher, freezing her in a river. Being a woman, she visited their sacred places, desecrating them. Proponents of the theory of local guilt present the following evidence. During Soviet times, admitting to religiosity could provoke repression of entire families. That's why all Mansi unanimously claimed that the students did not offend their feelings by passing through secluded trails. Had the government been different, perhaps some locals would not have been afraid to testify about a conflict on religious grounds. Most tourists were found in very light clothing and barefoot. No one would sleep like that in the cold. They definitely did not light the stove. Perhaps at night, the Mansi forced them out of the tent and made them undress. A few meters away from the tent, Igor Dyatlov's jacket was found, and in another direction, not far away, there were many students' hats. As experienced hunters, the killers could leave no traces or destroy them. During the examination of the body of one of the group members, Yuri Krivonyshenko, fragments of copper wire and pink ribbon were found in his pocket. Perhaps he deliberately or accidentally desecrated a Mansi sanctuary or damaged their amulet. Modern photo processing technologies have allowed enthusiasts to obtain new data. One researcher noticed strange objects in the photos taken by the athletes. One of them resembles a traditional Mansi amulet hung on a spruce. Another looks like a human face in a stiff hood, like those on local reindeer fur coats. As mentioned, the Ural hike of the Dyatlov Group was of the highest degree of difficulty. Its route was approved by an official commission. The event was intended to award participants the title of Master of Sport in Tourism. Therefore, only experienced, well-prepared, and fully healthy people were admitted. All members of the Dyatlov Group had sports titles, numerous victories and achievements, and passed strict theoretical exams on surviving in harsh conditions. Therefore, the actions of the tourists, later confirmed by the investigation, appear illogical to experts. Realizing the fact of snow descending from the mountaintop, the students hurried down the slope. Even a novice tourist knows that this should not be done categorically. An avalanche will catch up instantly on a straight trajectory. It can only be avoided by moving sideways, that is, away from the summit. Why the skilled athletes forgot this rule is unknown. The group's activity was not originally time-oriented. The team was behind schedule. Apparently, because of this, the leader allowed himself to command the start of the ascent very late, at 3 p.m. It was obvious that it was impossible to reach a convenient place for overnight before dark. The tent had to be set up on a windy slope without vegetation in a hurry. Because of this, the tourists dug the tent's base too deep, disrupting the integrity of the snow slab. Experienced tourists wonder why Dyatlov and his subordinates decided to seek refuge from the wind in the forest. It was 1.5 kilometers away down the snowy slope. In conditions of frost below -30 degrees and a blizzard, without proper clothing, this distance could easily be fatal. A small snow slab avalanche had occurred. Everyone should have known that further collapse was unlikely according to science. Why condemn themselves to a long journey when they could wait near the tent and then return to it for necessities? Obviously, heading to the forest, the group intended to use their storage. However, in reality, they went in the completely opposite direction. Judging by the tracks, there was no blind panic among the tourists. Then why didn't any of the 8 remaining conscious people orient themselves in the crossed terrain, realize the mistake? The descent to the forest takes at least an hour. During this time, one could think through the correct path. The events of 1959 at Dyatlov Pass still provoke numerous discussions. What do you believe in? Which expert hypothesis is closer to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching and see you next time.